Do you remember the first meal we had together in Chicago?
I do. The charred
Do you
steak.
remember? Do you remember what you ordered?
Charred steak.
And tell the audience, what was it? Charred?
It was very charred. It was all black.
Like a brick of charcoal charred, right?
Exactly.
And you ate most of it, didn't you?
Ate about half of it. And I started wondering what I was doing.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I am your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you stories and wisdom from some of the best CMOs in healthcare today. The leaders on this show face some of the toughest challenges in healthcare today, and they will share with you their insights about the role and the responsibilities that come with the title of Chief Medical Officer. Today, our guest is Dr. Rex Hoffman, Chief Medical Officer at Providence Holy Cross Medical Center, Mission Hills, California. Dr. Hoffman grew up in Los Angeles, California, and he earned his undergraduate degree from UC San Diego. He earned his medical degree from Tulane University's School of Medicine and returned to California for his residency in radiation oncology at UC San Francisco. Rex, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I suspect you've learned a few things along the way while you were on your journey to becoming a chief medical officer. But before we get to that, some important background. Do you remember the first meal we had together in Chicago?
I do. The charred steak.
Do you remember what you ordered?
Charred steak.
And tell the audience, what was it? Charred?
It was very charred. It was all black. I'd eat it. It's quite a meal.
Like a brick of charcoal charred, right?
Exactly.
And you ate most of it, didn't you?
Ate about half of it. And I started wondering what I was doing.
Now, fast forward. I'm sorry, go ahead.
With so many other options on the menu, why did I choose the charred ones? So,
why? Why did you choose it?
Sounded interesting. I didn't realize it was going to really be charred.
Yeah, you better be careful next time. But, then we had another wonderful meal, and you did order a steak. This was in Nashville, and it turned out much better, I believe, right?
Yes, I definitely became a believer again in good steaks. Yes.
And we warned you not to order the charred option, which fortunately was not on the menu.
Yes. Yes.
Well, tell the audience a little bit about how you arrived at your position as Chief Medical Officer.
Yeah, Lee. So it was quite a journey, actually. So I was practicing radiation oncology for about 7 years, became a medical director about 7 years in of radiation oncology in the department where I was working. And with that came a lot of different leadership responsibilities. One of which ultimately was that I was the physician lead for Providence's radiation oncology work group, where I represented 29 other radiation oncology medical directors across the health system. And in that venue, I worked closely with several leaders to secure a large contract with Electa, the vendor, to purchase 12 new linear accelerators for 12 different departments across 5 states, saving $10 million in the process. And I remember during those conversations, I was sitting next to the Providence CFO as well as the treasurer, negotiating these large deals, and really realized that my Achilles heel was a lack of understanding when it really came to healthcare finance. And so subsequently looked at MBA programs since I felt that was the direction I wanted to go into to get a better understanding, and went to Kelley School of Business at Indiana University for my business and medicine MBA. While there, one of my classmates was a chief medical officer, and I really enjoyed listening to him, how he spent his day with all the different responsibilities, whether it was strategy, whether it was disruptive physician behavior, whether it was provider engagement, things like this. It all really fascinated me. And coupling that really with the time in my career for radiation oncology, I was ready to move on. And so I felt that this time I really wanted to pursue being a chief medical officer. But what did that mean? And so I really sought out some advice from people. I have a friend that had been a CMO, chief medical officer, and he's basically suggested, Rex, you got to learn the vocabulary and really understand what comes with the job. And so he recommended I join the quality committee, the utilization management committee, and the credentials committee, really to get a better understanding for what was involved with the CMO and how the day usually went. And so I did that, and really got a better understanding of how things worked, what some of the terms were that I need to be familiar with. Because certainly as a radiation oncologist, you're not really dealing with length of stay and readmissions. And so it was all kind of a new world to me. And then lo and behold, about 6 months later, a chief medical officer position opened at a sister hospital. And the CEO happened to be the CMO who I had talked to about those committees. And so thank goodness I heeded his advice and did go on those committees. And subsequently later on, after applying, I got the job.
That's a great origin story. And it's common amongst those who seek these roles that there are gaps that they recognize, like finances or some of the hospital operations, like length of stay. And it does take a little deliberate intention to arrive in the role. So great story. You or I specifically have decided to separate people into three categories as I go around and talk to chief medical officers. What I'm curious about is within those three categories, what your coworkers might think about you. Those three categories include an analytical personality, somewhat aggressive personality, or diplomatic personality. And there are physician leader archetypes that fit into that very nicely. Dr. William Osler, Dr. Michael DeBakey, Dr. Anthony Fauci. So if we could adopt my thinking for just a hot minute, what do you think your coworkers would say about you fitting one of those types of categories, or pick another one if you think of something else?
Sure. So good question, and definitely something to think about. I would think in my case, probably a combination of being analytical and diplomatic. And I think that to be a successful CMO, you really have to have both of those characteristics. You need to be able to analyze the situation, look at the different viewpoints, and really then come up with a solution and navigate the personalities throughout the process. And that's what gets you to be a successful CMO. So I would say I'm probably somewhere between William Osler and Fauci, which I think is an incredible company. So I'm very honored by that. And, but I think that's kind of, for me, it's really a combination of those two, I think.
As you think about the role model and the mentor individuals that you alluded to in your origin story, and you think about the type of leader that you are as embodied by either Dr. Osler or Dr. Fauci, is there anything that you want to mention about the degree of influence that those role models or mentors had with you? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that relationship was like, or what types of tools did they put in your toolbox with you or teach you about as you began to ascend to the CMO role?
Yeah, so I'm really visual, and I like to really observe people and the way they handle different situations. So in addition to being on these different committees that I talked about a second ago, I really started evaluating the CMO that was at my hospital as well as the other hospitals and see how they manage different things. So as a CMO, you're always on stage. People are always watching. And so it's really important to be cognizant that your actions carry a lot of clout. And so you build a reputation over time, and you can destroy it in a matter of seconds. And so you need to be really respectful, appreciate the integrity that comes with a job, and realize you're really leading all the time by example. And so I watched other CMOs do things that I thought were a good idea and not such a good idea, and really tried to put in my toolkit those that I respected by handling things the way that I thought was correct, and try to avoid incorporating things that maybe people could have done differently that subsequently hurt their reputations.
I think that's wonderful. Our listeners tend to be those who are both very curious about what it's like to be a chief medical officer and potentially aspire to be one. So I would advocate that watching those in the role and understanding some of those dynamics. Look, it's not that different in our training. We are taught to hold a very specific body of knowledge to care for somebody. And we do have to be conscientious that we have this knowledge and we have the ability to work somebody up, diagnose them, and treat them. And therefore, we are on stage for them, and how we conduct ourselves as professionals is critically important to gaining their trust and to seek the best outcome for the patient. So it's a natural skill for us, but we don't think of it when we go into some of these leadership roles. And you just pointed out a really great strategy or tactic, rather, for a young leader as they begin to think about the role. What was perhaps one of the hardest or the single hardest thing you faced as a CMO, aside from the pandemic? You and I were both in the hot seat during that time, and that has been talked about by others. But I'm curious if you can identify the hardest thing you have faced other than that.
Yeah, so I remember there was an incident that happened actually from the get-go, right when I became a chief medical officer. In fact, the first week, I got a call from the ICU charge nurse telling me that there was a doctor in the hallway yelling at one of his nurses about a patient.
Shocking. I've never heard of this in my entire career.
So what I did was I immediately dropped everything. I went down to the hallway in the ICU, and I wanted to witness what she was describing. And sure enough, there was a physician yelling at a nurse in front of a patient. So what I did was immediately I pulled the physician aside and I asked him first to lower his voice. And then I asked him, what was he so angry about? And apparently his patient had been moved to the hallway outside the ICU from the ICU. And he had never been explained why that happened, nor had he been given the common courtesy of being told ahead of time that that was going to happen. And so I figured, yes, you should have been told ahead of time that this was going to happen. But let's get the patient's nurse together. Let's meet with her to better understand how this decision was made and really try to work through it. So I found a quiet room. 3 of us sat down, and she went on to explain that a mass trauma had come into the hospital where there were 3 critically ill patients that all required an ICU bed. And so the ICU charge nurse and the ICU medical director evaluated the acuity level of all the patients in the ICU to see who had the lowest acuity. And it turned out to be his patient. And so subsequently, they made the decision to move that patient temporarily into the hallway until they could secure a necessary bed. Well, he went on to complain that why his patient, and again, we went through that, and eventually he calmed down, and she expressed that she was sorry. She goes, yes, in retrospect, absolutely, we should have notified you ahead of time. He then went on to express a concern about the safety of his patient in the hallway. Now, all of a sudden, this patient's in the hallway. Who's caring for the patient? Is someone always watching the patient? And she went on to explain how they called in another nurse to help care for the patients, the trauma patients in the ICU, so she could spend her time be dedicated to his patient while they're in the hallway to make sure that they were appropriately cared for. So once we went through this dialogue and his concerns and anger was addressed, he calmed down. We resolved the issue.
So several questions pop up out of that story. Why was that one of the hardest things for you? Was it temporal because you were new to the role, or you've never seen anything quite like that?
I'd say I was new to the role. I had not seen anything at that point quite like that. And I think that it was kind of like trial by fire, right? You're kind of jumping in the situation. Now you have new responsibilities. You also comes with the CMO some clout, but you also got to respect that. And you also got to realize too, you're representing administration. And nurses are caregivers, and they need an advocate. And that really is your role in that particular situation, to be, in this case, an advocate for the nurse. Now, there are many cases where I'm an advocate for the physician. So you really have to evaluate and analyze the whole situation to figure out where you're going to take a stand in a particular role. And so on this particular case, it was really being an advocate for the nurse. But there have been instances certainly where I'm an advocate for the physician, where the nurse is maybe someone that is not someone I may disagree with in a particular situation. And so it's something you really need to again, getting back to the Osler Fauci comparison, talking about really analyzing a situation and then be diplomatic. Well, I want everyone to get along. And, I learned really early on, that's literally impossible. It's very hard to accomplish that. And so really try to lean into my diplomatic skills to really view a situation, assess all the different possible options, and then come up with the best solution for the institution as well as the individuals involved.
Yeah. Again, as physicians, we recognize that there's some ambiguity in what we do. There's some gray areas, and sometimes we just have to do the very, very best that we can with certain things that are not within our control, like everybody getting along all of the time.
Right.
So yeah, and it's remembering that we know how to do these things and then deploying them in a way that's effective from a leadership perspective, from a physician, nurse, administrative perspective. And that's that's a trial by fire, which is partly why we call this the Fire Chief podcast, right?
Yes. Properly called, yes.
Yeah. So, and some of the issues sound very valid from the physician point of view, not having all of the information at the physician's disposal as to why there had been a change in the physical location of the patient, and then the background. And sometimes when things happen real quickly, like a mass casualty or a heavy trauma, it's hard to get all the communication into the right place at the right time. That those types of things stay with us during our career. If we take a similar thought process and apply the thinking to what was the biggest fire that you had to fight, and hopefully you were able to put out, and even if you weren't, what was the biggest fire that you've had to deal with in your role?
Yeah, so negotiating contracts is a big issue. And, sometimes, once in a while, physicians are not happy with the contract they have and want to negotiate a new one, and sometimes threaten to leave as a result of that. You're kind of all of a sudden now you're trying desperately to make sure that you can provide the services necessary to take care of the population you serve. And so we've had issues with several medical groups. One of them recently has been the radiology group. And the prior group kind of imploded for different reasons. A lot of them went into the remote setting, which is a big option now a lot of radiologists are seeking. But we had a core group of interventional radiologists that were fantastic and really wanted to stay, but they felt that they could not absorb all the volume for radiology, particularly the diagnostic side of it. Now, so we sat down, my chief executive, myself, and the leader of this particular group, and go, listen, we want to make this work. How can we make this work? And really work through this for a while. And subsequently came up with a solution that's actually worked out extremely well. And so we have the 4 interventional radiologists on site. We then send all the diagnostic to an external company remotely, does all the remote diagnostic, reads all the remote diagnostic imaging, and it tends to work well. Now, there have been some hiccups over the way, but we've worked through those. Initially, the medical staff was very upset and frustrated with the length of time it got for them to turn around reads. That has improved over time with the open communication. The interventional radiologists certainly take care of all the procedures on site, as well as if there's an emergent reading that needs to take place right away that can't really wait for the remote people to address. They take care of that as well. But it did put out a fire that I know a lot of other hospitals are struggling with right now that really can't stand up interventional radiology and subsequently have to send it out. It's really finding physicians that are passionate about the hospital, aligned with the hospital, and really showing them some love as well when it comes to paying them appropriately to provide that service. And then checking it regularly over time to figure out ways to tweak and improve it so that it works for everyone.
Are there any, how do I ask this question? Were there any tools in your leadership toolkit that you use to navigate the difficulty with the situation?
Yeah, well, one was really listening. So what was most important to the interventional radiologists? I mean, in this day and age, they have choices where they can go anywhere. I mean, they're basically a hot commodity right now and could certainly go to some of our competitors. So really figuring out what was it that drew them to our hospital, what distinguished our hospital, what they like, and what did they not like, and try to figure out ways to break down some of those barriers and really ease their way going forward so that they can be set up for success. And so that's one thing I really do, a lot of active listening. Again, I observe as well. And really pay a lot of attention. I check in with them regularly as well. I walk by their office at least once a week to try to check in on them, poke my head in there, see if there's anything I can help with. So really showing them that we appreciate them and going out of our way to rule out the red carpet.
Yeah, I think, so I'm going to piggyback on that. The notion of listening is critical in the idea of seek first to understand. You will gain a lot more credibility, trust, get to the right place if you come in with that curiosity, seeking to understand what's going on. And then you hinted at coming back, and that's closing the loop.
Yes.
Closing the loop. And like your story in the intensive care unit, you had to de-escalate the situation. It was hot. It was intense. You were able to work through and begin to understand what the source of the frustration was, and then come back and say, yeah, you're right. We probably could have or should have, or next time we will do a better job of informing you of these types of changes. And it's the closing of the loop is where you really bank that credibility for later on when you need it. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And another thing that came out of the radiology as well was a lot of my fellow chief medical officers in my health system have run into similar scenarios. Because again, this is nationwide where there's a short of interventional radiologists, with a lot of them, preferring to go in the remote setting, which they need to be on site for interventional. And so others have set up hybrid programs very similar to ours, kind of using ours as a gold standard because it really has solved all of our problems at this point in time.
Yeah, great, great. So let's switch it up a little bit again. Please tell our listeners, if you don't mind, what is the hardest aspect for you personally of being in the role and of the work that you do? What's hard for you personally?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of chief medical officers, one of the things they really struggle with when first taking on the role is giving up clinical care and not being able to work directly with patients, as I had been doing for 19 years as a radiation oncologist. But I've kind of come to terms with this, and I kind of changed the way I look at it. So now I figure my patients are my medical staff, and so I check in with them regularly, help them manage and work through burnout and different things that they may be dealing with, really knocking down barriers to help them be successful in the way they deliver their care as much as possible, and really have done a lot of work in that area to help them succeed. And so it's that part of it, missing the direct patient contact, but again, using the medical staff as my new patients. And overall, they're doing very, very well, which brings me a lot of joy. Kind of like when we were practicing physicians, Lee, when your oncology patient was doing really well, you got some personal satisfaction out of that. And I get that same kind of feeling now with the medical staff when they're successful in what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I often felt that as well, borrowing the phrase, and you and I both were in the oncology space. The pathologist is the doctor's doctor, right? That's an old term because you had to go to the pathologist to help you understand a condition, and they were your doctor to help you do the things you needed to do. I did the same thing as a CMO. I looked at the medical staffs as, when I had several hospitals, as I have to help take care of them and be there for them and be there with them. That again also gives them a feeling of support that they may not be getting from other elements of the health system as it is today. So I thank you for sharing that. I definitely would agree with everything you said. If we could use some kind of time capsule or time machine, and you could go back to young Rex, your younger self, what would you say to young Rex about becoming a chief medical officer in his future?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, as I mentioned before, really seeking out other CMOs that are going through the process, really learning from them how they spend their job on a daily basis to see if that really resonates with what you envision, because the role of a chief medical officer can be very different from one chief medical officer to another. And it's really important to seek out from several chief medical officers what their day is like routinely so that you have better appreciation of that. I think also the advice that was given to me by the CMO that I mentioned earlier was getting involved in some of those committees that you'll be involved in as a CMO. The quality committee, the credentials committee, and the utilization management committee are just three of those that are very instrumental and important to understand. And then there's two resources now available today that were not available to me back then. And I wish I would have had, because back then it was all word of mouth is the way that we learned about CMOs and what they did. But now we have a couple book resources that actually can help you. And one is I Want to Be a Chief Medical Officer Now What, which is on sale on Amazon. And then you got another one called the Chief Medical Officer Essential Guidebook. And I see you smiling, Lee, because I know you're an author in both of them. And these have been great resources I really wish I would have had back in the day, because one of the stimuluses for writing both these books was to address exactly the question you're asking. It really gives you an inside look as to what a chief medical officer does and how best to prepare for that role if you're just depending on word of mouth, but now actually have something in writing.
Yeah, I'm smiling for many reasons, notwithstanding that, yes, I was a contributor and very happy with both of those books. But you just reminded me of the other thing you accomplished along the way, which is part of the genesis of how you and I met and how I helped contribute to your work. And that is I'll call it a handbook, but would you describe what you created for Providence?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So back in about 2020 or so, I was the interim chief medical officer over a region within Providence, as I was in between a transition from someone leaving the job prior to someone coming in. And so one of my responsibilities was really bringing on and onboarding new chief medical officers to some of the hospitals in the region. And it seemed crazy to me that there's really no resource that we could give them. Once again, it was all word of mouth. And I looked across the health system and saw over 100 chief medical officers, many with 5-10 years of experience. I'm like, what a waste. We have all this knowledge, and yet we're not sharing with the new chief medical officers to set them up for success. So I envisioned a book that would be handed to them upon their coming onto the role, and kind of a rite of passage, as you would say. And so we had this collaboration of 44 chief medical officer contributors across Providence talk about topics such as running the medical staff office, talk about working with managing the expectations of your boss, who's now usually the CEO, utilization management, managing disruptive behavior, spoken and shared through years of experience from several seasoned chief medical officers. And this handbook is still used to this day and still handed to new chief medical officers, and received a lot of very positive feedback on this. And so I was very proud how that came to fruition.
Yeah, it's a remarkable product on your part, and that Providence continues to support it. It is that type of intentional work that I'm most proud of when I work with chief medical officers, how there's a sense of putting things together and paying it forward and helping people aspire and achieve the things that they set for themselves in the role. So hats off to you for doing all of that work. And that in part has brought a lot of us together to talk about what it's like to help people be successful in the role as a chief medical officer. What do you think right now is the biggest fire in healthcare? And you may have alluded to it relative to interventional radiology and radiology in general. But what else do you believe is one of the largest fires out there? And what can a chief medical officer do about that, if anything at all?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I think there's several fires in healthcare today.
That's okay. Knowing that you're from California and like every other day, there's some crazy fire. We won't go there, but please share with us your thoughts.
Yeah. So one thing that's really looming, and chief medical officers see it every day, is kind of talking about the radiology a little bit, is the physician shortage that's in place today and is only going to get worse. And when you look at all the figures, it's pretty scary as to what's going to happen in terms of the shortage. And it's not just physicians, nurses as well, and other staff that work in the healthcare environment. But being a CMO, focusing on the physician side of things, one of the big reasons for this physician shortage is, it's severalfold. One is decreasing reimbursement. Another one is burnout. And burnout and physician well-being is so important, something I deal with daily as a chief medical officer, and have formed what's called a wellness council here at Holy Cross, where I have 12 physicians from multiple different specialties and really the influencers of the medical staff, and brought them together to really hear from them what some of their concerns were that were attributing to this physician burnout. And out of this rose several different things that we've incorporated into the culture that have really been physician pleasers. And I got to believe have really helped us recruit new physicians here at Holy Cross just by word of mouth, because I don't think other places are really doing this. For example, one is a lot of physicians are really burning out because they're getting these early morning or late night phone calls from nurses about patients. And so we developed a list of 13 items that nurses really should not call physicians about between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. There are some exceptions, some nuances to it. But also before calling a physician, they should check with their charge nurse first before calling a physician. Because we know there's always new nurses in the hospital. Sometimes are still learning their way as to what's appropriate. But physicians complain so much about being woken up at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and sleep, like for everyone, like you and I, Lee, is so important. And it really increases your irritability if you don't get it. And so that's been a real physician pleaser. We've done other things. Obviously, with the EMR, we've worked with our EPIC team. They come onto campus now routinely and really sit down with the physicians to figure out what their pain points are. Managing the inbox is another thing. So a lot of ways of trying to help ease the physician's way, give them some of that time back so they can spend time at home and doing things outside of healthcare that they've been feeling and getting encroached upon as they're getting paid less to do the same amount of work, or more work rather, in the same amount of time.
Yeah, wonderful to hear some of the solutions that I'm sure our listeners can apply to their own environment. The demands on the healthcare professionals continues to increase, and the resources are not really keeping pace, which is my simplistic view of burnout. When you have more demands than you have resources, when you and I started out, we carried Motorola pagers. If we were fortunate enough, we had early, mobile phones before they were, the smartphone as we know them today. And certainly we were called, and there's no doubt that that's been going back since the early part of modern healthcare, when interns and residents were literally interned in the hospital and residents on the campus. They lived there because that was the way you communicated with the house staff to get things done. But I think that the ease at which folks can connect with the doctors on call, I think there's an increased demand. And like you said, does every issue warrant phone call? And I also think the complexity of care that we provide today then warrants more issues. You might treat a potassium level with Kxalate 40 years ago, but now we can repeat and do this and that. And there's like 40 more things we're doing during the night that require 40 more phone calls, whereas back in the day, it was one phone call and check the potassium in the morning. Rightly or wrongly, it was a lot less demand on that one particular individual. So great stuff that you're sharing with the audience. Being a CMO is clearly not a small task, and it does take intentional preparation, much of which you've described with role models, mentors, writing a handbook, if you will. But a lot of what we do, akin to your first story that you shared with us, it's a trial by fire. My old boss, he told me that being a CMO is just like a career in firefighting. You start out by going to firefighting school, you train, you drill, and then you're ready to put out a fire. You put on the uniform, you start out as a fireman, and one day maybe you find yourself being called squad leader or captain, and then perhaps becoming a fire chief. And my boss always told me, you cannot be the fire chief without first becoming a firefighter. Rex, do you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. And, even when you become a seasoned CMO, you still are a firefighter in many cases. But it's really important to kind of take a step back and really sense and evaluate the whole situation, really getting back to analyzing like William Osler, and really listening to all viewpoints and really hearing every side of the story. Like a young CMO, like many young CMOs, I would jump to quick conclusions. I just want to fix it. That's how we are trained when we come out of medicine, right? You see a diagnosis, you have a treatment, you fix it. But now you got to kind of take a step back and really hear the different sides of the story. Because if you only go on the first side you hear, oftentimes it's missing key components that are necessary to make the right solution or decision. And so, again, you're always on stage, you're always leading by example, and take the time to make sure you really go through stuff. You don't have to give an answer necessarily even within the same day. Take your time to really make sure you get the best decision possible. And also the other thing is too, I'm very inclusive. I try to bring in subject matter experts in areas that I'm not a subject matter expert to really get their input on certain situations as well. So if I have maybe a question, a complaint that comes in about the quality of care, about, let's say, orthopedic surgery, I'll go to my orthopedic surgeon medical director and get his or her input on how best to address the situation, rather than trying to manage that as a CMO that was a radiation oncologist. So I really use the resources and the people around me to really help make the best decision possible. And again, sometimes that takes a little time to do.
That is another wonderful point that you're making. As we are trained, and nurses are trained similarly, basically to rush in with the trauma patient, with the patient who's coding, with someone who's going down really fast. We rush into the scene. First responders are given a different amount of training to assess the situation, because they might find themselves in harm's way. The firefighter is not instructed to run into the blazing house, until given the command to do so, or there is no other option to save a life. As a chief medical officer, I don't think we're adequately trained to take the moment and listen and seek to understand and unpack it. And when folks are frustrated, well, how come Dr. Hoffman's not giving me an answer? He's doing his due diligence for all the right reasons. Just give him a moment. So you need a supporting cast, as you alluded to, and then close the loop. Yeah, I'm sorry it took me an extra day to get back to you, but here's what I've uncovered. And more often than not, you continue to build credibility with your medical staff. It's one of the ways to reduce burnout, by having the right information, the right explanation, looking for answers that would change the status quo, and make it a great place for your staff to work and to recruit staff, given the limited resources that we have. So you're spot on, my man. And that's one of the great reasons I enjoy talking to CMOs, and particularly having you on the show. It has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show, Rex. Any additional comments that you want to make before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think one other key component of being a successful chief medical officer is really focusing and prioritizing physician satisfaction. We're so focused on patient satisfaction, but think about it. One of our main customers are the physicians. They have an opportunity to go to different places. Our competitor, in many cases, they can go to if they'd like. So really trying to figure out ways to roll out the red carpet, provide the most supportive environments possible, so these physicians want to be on your campus as compared to across the street. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, a lot of face-to-face meetings, a lot of rounding in the hospital, a lot of rounding in their medical offices to really show them that they're important and that you appreciate what they do.
Totally agree. And unfortunately, there are many segments of the healthcare system where physicians are seen as commodities. And if any of you hold that belief, I would love to get into a discussion with you. Physicians are not a commodity. They are not bought and sold on the open market as though anybody can do it. It may seem like it, but you really misunderstand. If that's the way you think about things, you misunderstand the value that a physician has to your ecosystem. Well, thanks again, Rex. You have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the CMO. Want to learn more about what it is like to be a CMO? Want to be on the show? Email me at leescheinbart@gmail.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. You can listen to the podcast on Apple, and you can also watch the videos of the shows on YouTube. Our show's website is thefirechief.podbean.com. I love talking with CMOs from all over the United States, so please connect, leave reviews and your comments, and share this with your colleagues, please. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.